Hello, welcome to Pulpit to Pew. I'm Johnny Gwin.
And I'm Beverly Gibson.
And this is the show that talks about the weekly sermon and the lessons and what the priest, that would be you, Beverly.
That's me.
What she was intending for me and the parishioners in the pews heard.
What actually got heard.
Right. All right, let me make sure I get this right. So I wrote down some themes this week because I don't want to stray too far like I tend to do.
That's a great idea.
So this week we talk about the nature of wicked.
Wicked. Who are the wicked?
The gift of wisdom.
Uh-huh.
The prophecy of the righteous man from the wisdom of Solomon.
Right.
Yes. We talk about the dark days of Walt Disney.
Yeah, we got there. How did we?
We'll see.
Yeah.
Facing our own frightful shadow selves.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
I do like saying that. I think I stole that from Wikipedia. So,
well, but the shadow self is wonderful.
Yes,
yeah.
And the power of drawing closer to God. And what we'll talk about what that, because we don't get into specifically how to do that, so I want at the end to hit on that. So,
that is important because that's kind of where things end up.
Yes, it does. So one of the lines in the... Is it the Psalm?
It was in the Psalm, right?
Actually, this is Wisdom of Solomon is Psalm. Is in the Psalm genre?
The wisdom literature of the Bible encompasses Psalms and Proverbs. The book of Job is in that category. Even our epistle for Sunday, the letter of James, is considered to be a form of wisdom literature.
Okay.
But it's especially true in the Septuagint, in the Old Testament, that one of the divisions of that literature is wisdom literature. And it's used to teach, to instruct, to guide the faithful in righteous living. And it has lots of different forms.
And coming from I would say if there was a patron saint of wisdom would be Solomon.
Solomon would be the guy. Yes, he would be. And then there is, in Proverbs, we meet with the figure of wisdom.
Which is a woman, right?
Who's a woman,
yeah.
Right. And that is, we see her, and I think you and I have talked about this before a few years ago. Lady Luck, or Fortuna, is a kind of shadow of the wisdom figure, of the one that guides the wheel, or that is behind all things, and the concept of wisdom as a figure is also related to the notion of the Holy Spirit as well.
But it's interesting that something that is really looked favorably upon, especially kings. Wisdom is so looked like. That's what a lot. David asked to God to make sure he had wisdom to lead his people, but it's a feminine. It's a spirit. It's a feminine represented
spirit.
by a feminine character. That's really interesting because in a world where we kind of think that it's such a patriarchal world that something held so high is not a man.
Right, and there are various figures in classical literature.
Yeah, the muse.
The muse is there, and you'll also see different personages in, say, Greek literature who are wise women.
The Lady of the Lake with Excalibur.
Well, that's a good one. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. The Old Testament reading that I did not choose this Sunday.
The faithful wife, right?
Is the capable wife, and that's another. And you'll see I just got a big line drawn through that, and I thought we're just going to move over here to the Wisdom of Solomon, just because it's new and it's different, and that the capable wife passage, and this is just me talking, is so overworked. It gets worked over so hard, and there's nothing I can bring to that conversation right now that, in my mind at least, is going to redeem that conversation as it's happening out there in the world. And people bring a lot of baggage to this. And I'm not saying that it's not worth talking about. It was just, when I looked at this Sunday, I thought, punt, we're going to go the other way. And it took me to the wicked, because the word wicked turns up in everything this Sunday. And
that's a good getting into it, because you said the other reading, it just, with cultural sensitivities and just, to be honest, I'm just tired of hearing it. If it's interesting to you, it's going to be more interesting to everybody else, because the sermon's got...
So just who are the wicked? That was my first question, and that remained my question as I read the lessons for this Sunday. The very first line of the very first psalm in the Bible begins like this: "Happy are they who have not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor lingered in the way of sinners, nor sat in the seats of the scornful." Sinners, I know, lots of them. That was a joke. Come on, give me something. This may be the only joke in the whole sermon. Sinners, I know. I understand scornful. But wicked is harder to draw a bead on. Clearly, Psalm 1 is very much concerned with the wicked. And in addition to the psalm, 2 of our lessons today address the wicked and wickedness directly. And all 3 of these readings are part of what we call in the Bible the wisdom literature. It's intended to teach. It's intended to form God's people into the people that He calls them to be. And the gospel today, as we will see, deals with the effects of what could be called wickedness, where it can lead or mislead all of us, those of us who would follow Jesus. Wicked in English is a relatively old word, and it's tied in our tradition to the word Wicca, which means witch. You're familiar with that. And it's associated with evil. But like most words, it's subject to change over time, and it transforms itself and distorts, and its meaning can get slippery, so much so that in our contemporary parlance, wicked can even now mean good, as in wicked good. And it refers, I think L.L. Bean refers to their bedroom slippers sometimes as wicked. Extremely good. So good it's bad. But that doesn't actually help us here. So let's go back to recapture a sense of what the word means that will help us make some sense of how Scripture speaks to us today, across the ages and across all the cultures, that it transposes and speaks to us directly now, right where we are today.
I was really overcome with that question when I read through the lessons initially. My big question was, who are the wicked?
Right, and I like that question because that's a big opener. Like, hey, I'm just curious, who do you think is truly wicked?
The wicked. I mean, as a category, who are the wicked? And it says something that the very first psalm focuses itself on that. I mean, obviously, it's there to talk about the antithesis, which is the righteous. But that can't be all it's about. I mean, there has to be some depth to this. And so let's take a dive into it and see where we find ourselves.
But you mentioned we're all sinners.
We are indeed.
Okay, and there is a difference between those who sin and truly wicked. It's like a level up of evil. It's like, whoa, no, these people are the ones that draw the sinners to them and make them worse. It's kind of what I'm hearing. Right.
Well, Psalm 1, it has a progression in its language. I mean, this is the very first verse. Happy are they who have not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor lingered in the way of sinners, nor sat in the seats of the scornful. So it's possible that you could argue that the psalmist is saying the same thing 3 different ways. But really, those are not necessarily the same thing. You've got the counsel of the wicked, the way of sinners, the seats of the scornful. And what I said in the sermon was, scornful, I understand. I get scorn. And I said, I know sinners. And then I thought that was funny.
You had to repeat
and say, that's actually.
But telling a joke from the pulpit's tough sometimes.
It's tough.
Because people want to be like, oh, it's got to be so serious.
Well, and this is just a rhetorical ploy in some ways. At the beginning, you want to loosen people up just a little bit because they're all sitting there kind of, either they've zoned out immediately or they're like honed in, like I'm really serious and I'm paying attention. And you want to bust that up just a little bit so that their mind's open, because if you're open to a little bit of humor, then you're open to more nuance in the other things you hear. And that was a very little bit of humor, I must say. It was a minuscule amount, but at least it got a little laugh. It caused people to loosen just a little bit, and then we could kind of enter into it. Especially because I knew I was going to tell a story, and the story was going to carry the weight of a lot of the sermon, and I wanted them to be able to really hear it.
And then the story is Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Come, which you did mention from the dark days of the Walt Disney Vault.
I did. I went back and watched the movie.
So I'm going to ask you a question about that after.
You remember, I hope, if you're old enough to have been through school, you remember the witches of Macbeth. You remember that part. as the world comes apart at the beginning of Act 4, and the three weird sisters gather again in the second, which says, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes, and then enters Macbeth, a man who was, at one point in his life, a good man and a good leader, and who at this point is a murderer. Now, this is a phrase, that something wicked this way comes, that has entered our language since then, like lots of phrases from Shakespeare. And in 1962, the writer Ray Bradbury published a story with that same phrase as its title, Something Wicked This Way Comes. I remember reading it when I was young. I remembered it faintly, and I only realized this week, as I thought about it, that it was made into a movie in 1983. It was a Disney movie. These were the dark days of Disney. After the death of Walt and before Eisner saved the mouse, they were out there making movies about Ray Bradbury stories. And as I thought about it, I decided I'd like to see the movie, and so I ordered it, and I convinced our daughter Eleanor to watch it with me, and I found it compelling and relevant, even though to the sensibilities of a contemporary 14-year-old, its 96 minutes seemed slow. It is the story of two 13-year-old boys, the fatherless Jim Nightshade and his good friend William Halloway. William's father is older, and he is the librarian in the little town they live in, an idyllic little town in the Midwest called Greentown, Illinois. And the story takes place during the Great Depression. The boys, who are right there on the cusp of adolescence, really want to be older. They want to be able to adventure on their own and be independent and live lives of young men. While many of the town's residents that we meet in the story, the school teacher, the barber, the newsstand operator, the old football star, all of them long to be younger, to recapture that former vitality and live out a reality different from the one that they have come to find. So into this American landscape on an October night comes Mr. Dark's Pandemonium Carnival by train. They pull into town, and miraculously the carnival is set up, and it creates great stir in the quiet local life. It's House of Mirrors, which you can gain access to only if you're an adult and with a special ticket, shows the entrance, the image of the false self that they long to see. Youthful, desirable, wealthy, healthy, and whole. The carousel, which is carefully tarped and kept guarded, moves both forward and backward, and as it does, its riders move through time, becoming older or younger according to their desire. But of course there is a catch. Mr. Dark and his troupe live, they thrive off of the lives that they capture and enslave. He offers the illusion of power over one's circumstances and over life and time, but he delivers a deeper brokenness and bondage. The old maid school teacher becomes young and beautiful, but she also becomes blind. The lonely barber finds the attention of many women, but he becomes their servant and their fool. Certainly the wickedness here is darkness and evil, but the interesting thing is that its power derives from and thrives on the lives of ordinary people, just regular folks. Now the boys, and especially young Jim Nightshade, are Mr. Dark's prime target. They are the most useful to his continued power. But his threat is undone by the aging Mr. Holloway, the librarian, who is wise and who resists the temptation of Mr. Dark's appeal to his own self-pity and connects with the boys and empowers them in their own budding humanity. And Mr. Dark, along with the wickedness that he brought and found, is defeated by wisdom and courageousness and selflessness in action. And Mr. Holloway's gentleness, his wisdom, his willingness to accept his own life as it is and to take responsibility saves the day for his son and for his young friend. And yes, it's a story of fantasy and some horror, but it's also fundamentally a story of hope and of wisdom.
What triggered in your brain to go, for my sermon and writing, that I need to go get the 1982 film of Something Wicked This Way Come by Ray Bradbury and Walt Disney?
All right. Well, that's interesting. It's an interesting thing about the human mind, because I read through the lessons, and obviously, I came up on wicked, and I go through and I underline words that jump out at me. And that was one of them. And I'm sitting there thinking, wicked, 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 wicked. And then I thought, something wicked this way comes. And I knew that came from Macbeth.
Right.
And I thought, but it's something else. I know it's something else. Who wrote the story? And then it came to me that it was Ray Bradbury. And then, of course, Google is our friend.
Yes.
And so I looked that up. I get a little bit about it. I remember having read this story when I was young. I did not realize that there was a movie version, and I had not seen it.
You tell the story very well in the sermon. You give it a very good summary of it. It's a lot of adult themes for a children's book.
Yeah. It's not a dark movie, but It's fairly dark.
Yeah.
And it has some, as I was watching, it's rated PG.
Yeah.
And as I say in the sermon, I coerced is too strong a word. I induced my 14-year-old daughter into watching this with me. And
who loves the Hunger Games?
Right, I love the Hunger Games.
Man.
She's
that's a lot of action.
No stranger to darker stuff. But it unfolds the story in a very effective way, I think. And it's got some really good acting in it, and it's very well put together. And the themes are nicely drawn out. So I order it on Amazon Prime, and a day and a half later, it's in my mailbox, and we can watch it. And I'm very glad we did, because I think it continued to be, for me, a way to unfold this whole notion that we're going to talk about now in just a second, of the wicked or the ungodly summoning death. Mm-hmm. And stories, to have a visual for that, to have characters, to see things unfold with characters that you can understand and real people, helps give some life and some meaning to an ancient text. For me, and I hope it does for other people too.
I tell you what I find so interesting in the story of the characters and the librarian. Mr. Dark.
Mr. Dark
shows up with his Pandemonium Carnival. But you mentioned to me earlier before we started, and we were talking about the themes of this story, that he's drawn there by regular people because they summon him with their yearning, which goes back to ungodly people summon death in the reasoning of Wisdom of Solomon. And that is like such a nice correlation to that. That darkness lies in all of us. And we have these things that are that shadow self, that thing of like not the best part of ourselves.
Right. And we tend to externalize that. We project that somewhere else. And that's really where the sermon is headed, at least in one aspect. We want to think of the wicked as our enemies.
Somebody else.
As those people with whom we deeply disagree on a number of fronts. Those people who are immoral, those people who are violent, those people who are lots of different things that we may attach to the wicked. And that allows us not to consider our own implication.
Right.
And the fact that there is darkness in every single one of us, and that it summons the darkness to us.
Right.
And that's a lot of what this teaching is about. The letter of James passage that we have comes to this, and that is...
The two verses that actually precede our reading today from the Wisdom of Solomon explain that God did not make death. Meaning by that, not the physical reality of death, but eternal separation from God. God did not make that. God does not delight, the text says, in the death of the living. He created things so that they might exist, so that they might thrive. The generative forces of the world are wholesome, the writer says, and there is no destructive poison in them. The dominion of Hades, as we heard in our reading today, is not on earth. That place of death is not here. And righteousness is immortal. That is, by the way, the first mention of immortality in the Old Testament. The ungodly, our reading tells us, summon death. This is a form called the diatribe, which is a little drama, and death is personified, and those people who are ungodly summon him up, and they present their case in front of him for us to hear and to know in its insufficiency. They consider death a friend, and so they make a covenant and they keep company with him, and their reasoning, we're told, is not sound. And it leads them to lie in wait for the righteous man who makes them feel bad about themselves. His very existence is a reproach to them. His gentleness, his forbearance, his awareness that he is a child of God angers them. So they set out to test the righteous man with insults and torture, condemning him to a shameful death. And that should sound familiar. But they were wrong. They were led astray by false reason and blinded by wickedness, ignorant of the secret purposes of God. And the verse that follows the conclusion of our reading says that God created us for his own eternity, for incorruption in his image. But through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his company experience it.
Let's go back to the Disney film.
Well, yeah, but it is.
But Holloway, the elder, he's a librarian, which is interesting because that kind of says wisdom.
It does say wisdom.
And then his humility, but he's unable to fight Mr. Dark, because for whatever reason, I guess his frailty of because he's older than his wife, and I guess it's
he has a heart problem.
Mortality.
He can only have one cigar and one glass of whiskey a day.
Yeah. But then you have youth, his son, and then kind of the rebellious Nightshade. What's his name? Jim. It's not Nightingale.
Jim Nightshade.
Jim Nightshade. Mm-hmm. So you have these two, archetypes. The kind of rebel guy and the librarian son. But they are the one that have the energy and the selflessness to be able to take on evil, Mr. Dark.
They have that the energy of youth, and they're 13, so they're really on that cusp of wanting to grow up. They really want to be out in the world, and Dark is really very, very interested in Jim Nightshade. He's the one that he really wants, because
he's on the edge.
He's on the edge.
Yeah.
His father is gone. He wants to grow up. He's got that energy, and yet there's no wisdom around him. There's no protective teaching. There's no mentoring. There's no nothing.
That's opportunity there, because you see all those traits. Again, goes back to, if nobody's watching the cupboard, only seeing your false self and not looking internally who you are, that creates a door for not doing the right thing.
Right.
Because you don't know the right thing, because you don't know the right you.
Well, let's go back and talk about Mr. Holloway, because he is very, very interesting and helpful for us in this regard. He is able, through his own wisdom and his own humility, his own acceptance of some of his own frailty, his own weakness, his own shortcomings, he is able to divorce himself from his own personal pity party, right? Which Dark knows and tries to seduce him into. Mm-hmm. He's able to separate himself from that and focus his attention on the boys,
right,
who really need him. Yeah. And then he's able to guide them.
So that's his selflessness.
Right. And if you'll remember, one of the big dramatic scenes actually happens in the library. Mr. Holloway finds his grandfather's journal. His grandfather had also been the librarian of this town, and his grandfather has written about this same carnival coming to town.
That's right, yep.
And it kind of reveals what is at stake here. And the boys are with him, and they're reading this book, and Dark comes to the library, and that's where he captures the boys and takes them back to the carnival. And then you've got the denouement and all that kind of good stuff that comes down. And there's, a great tilting carnival, carousel scene, and lots of other things that happen.
Trapped in a place that is not the best for you is where they're sent, or to be lost forever. So is Holloway the righteous man?
I believe he is in that story.
In the Wisdom of Solomon, we know the righteous man is actually prophecy of Jesus, which I do love that line. let us lie in wait for the righteous man because he is inconvenient to us and opposes our actions, which is true. Nobody you think social norms and, no, we're not awful people. And then someone shows up and says, this is where you fail at every turn. It's hard to make that speech because you're the person saying you people are not as wholesome as you think you are.
Right. But, I come back to that phrase, and I think I mentioned this in the sermon, that the ungodly reasoned unsoundly. They don't think well. Mm-hmm. They don't think well, and they don't express themselves well. And that's part of the problem.
Right.
I mean, it's not just about belief, but
it's
ignorance. It's ignorance. It's about how do you see the world? Do you actually see reality? And do you see yourself in terms of reality? Or do you see a false image of all these things?
And then according to most philosophers, they will tell you all reality is a perception. It's all not what you think it is. So boy, does that get confusing.
Well, it can.
But it's the idea of, this is what I see it because I'm trying my best to quit.
The letter of James, which we have been reading for some time this summer, is sometimes called the wisdom epistle. It does the same kind of thing. It focuses on teaching about the wisdom from above, as opposed to the wisdom of this world. The wisdom of this world, the writer says, leads to envy, to selfish ambition, to disorder, to wickedness of every kind. The wisdom from above is pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits. And the way to that wisdom, James writes, is to ask to be ready to receive it and to submit, he says, to God. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. And then, he says, the devil will flee.
One of the carnival rides or attractions was one of them is looking in that mirror.
Right.
Right? Well, how obvious is that? You're looking in the mirror for this thing you think you want to portray to the world, but that's the funny thing. It's like sucking the soul out of you because you're not looking at the true self. You're looking at the false self.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what that mirror shows you. Right. Is that false image that you want to see, that you want to be, that self that you project to the world.
Right.
And that's not your true self.
And if it's not honest, it's dangerous.
Right. Well, it for want of a better word, it can harden. It can reify. It can become the only self you have because you don't know the true self that's inside of you that participates in the life of God. The false self, if it hardens, right, and becomes the only self that's there, then works off of these emotions and tendencies that James names as being part of wickedness or part of the ungodly. And they're things that are familiar to all of us. It's envy, it's selfish ambition, it is all of those things that motivate us in a kind of violent, defensive, or aggressive way. And he puts the antithesis around that with wisdom is the word he uses for it. Righteousness would be a more traditional word from the Old Testament for that he describes as peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy, good fruits. And we come around in the sermon to talking about humility, and that's the real tie-in with the gospel. And that's where all of this is headed.
Well, and it's also tied in with it.
Now, despite Jesus' teaching on his way about the way of humility and his own way to his followers, his disciples still didn't get it. They didn't get it last week, and they still don't get it today as we make our way through Mark's gospel. They did not understand, Mark says, what Jesus was saying about his role as the Messiah. And worse yet, they were afraid to ask. They preferred to mask their ignorance with false confidence and posturing as they made their way through Galilee following Jesus. When Jesus began to teach them again in Capernaum, he let them know that he had noticed them talking among themselves on the way. And he said, "What were you talking about?" And they didn't want to tell him, so they hung their heads, because they'd been talking among themselves about who was the greatest, which they didn't understand either. So Jesus taught them about true greatness. The child he took up in his illustration was not for them, as it would be for us, an image of innocence and goodness. In their time, although their parents loved them quite often, children had no rights, no standing, no influence, no status. They were, as they are today, totally dependent, totally vulnerable, totally powerless. And this is the image of greatness that Jesus puts in front of his disciples. This is the greatness that he teaches. Whoever is willing to be the last of all, whoever is willing to be the servant of all, whoever welcomes all, will be the first in his kingdom.
Characters, real people, disciples in the gospel,
Right.
who you would think have some wisdom, considering their proximity to, purity and the Son of God.
They've got every opportunity. But I love the way that Mark describes this scene, because they've been walking along and they get to Capernaum and they go in a house and he starts teaching them again the same thing that he was teaching them just before, which we heard last week. Which is about the first being last and all of that. So he looks at him and he says, by the way, what were y'all talking about on the road? And they know that he knows, right? It's like looking at your dog after he's torn something up, and they just hang their heads. They just put their
shuffling
heads
their
down.
feet.
It's like, man, we don't want to tell you because we were talking about which one of us is the greatest.
How embarrassing is that? That is so embarrassing, so petty.
That's what we were talking about all that way. And that's when you have the final teaching of this gospel lesson, when he brings in the little child and he says, this is what it is. This is what the kingdom is. You have to be like this child. And once again, it helps us to, talking about wisdom, talking about tradition, talking about all of that, to bring some context into that. Because for us, right, and I say this in the sermon, seeing that child conveys a sense of innocence. It's kind of that romantic sense of childhood that we now have carried into the modern world. And that is not the notion of a child that would have existed in the ancient times. Not that people didn't love their children, because they did, but what he's really getting at is the fact that the child has no status. It's completely dependent. It's vulnerable. It has no power. It has no right. And Jesus is saying that's who you have to be. You have to be someone with no status, no power, no rights, no nothing. And that's really very troublesome to us. Yeah,
because the last thing you're going to think is you don't have any control or power over things. And vulnerable is not something that Americans do very well.
No, it's not. And in fact,
strive to be vulnerable. We don't even strive to be vulnerable.
Vulnerability is terrible. In our contemporary understanding. But most of the things that get drawn out in here are. I mean, if you look at much of what James says here, there are plenty of people sitting in the pews on Sunday who, if I were just having a passing conversation with me, they'd tell me this is absolute foolishness.
Right.
To be peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy. Are you kidding me? You don't understand the world.
But that's the inconvenient truths of what the righteous man was talking about in the first reading. It's like it makes us uncomfortable to go, ooh, I'm not that. I'm not that. And how impossible would it be to be that person?
Well, it also, forgive me for saying this, reveals a profound ignorance about the power of gentleness.
Yeah.
And if you go back in even more recent history, if you look at someone like Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., to bring the message of peace and gentleness and nonviolence to what you're doing is extraordinarily powerful, and it angers people, it threatens them, and in some ways it sparks great violence.
Well, to be able to not only convince your followers that the way to be is not to raise your hand back or defend yourself is amazing to me. Talk about some courage. That's taking nothing to a gunfight, not a knife, nothing, and know that gentleness and that patience and that pain you're suffering is your biggest sword is unbelievable to me. Because if it's done properly, there is no way to defend it. There's no way to defend it. It's amazing. But again, the pain and the loss leading up to that to resolution is going to be huge.
It is.
Yeah.
And I like that you use the word suffering, because that's tremendously deep and powerful part of what we're talking about, and a part of Jesus's message. That's exactly what he's teaching them before they get into what they've been talking about, because he says the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed he will rise again. He's been predicting his own suffering and his own death, and that is the most powerful thing he can do. And there's no way they can understand that. And so, as we've been saying in this conversation, they displace, they turn outward, and they start talking about status and greatness and the false image, because they have no way of comprehending that. And that's the deep lesson here.
And that's summoning death. I mean, because not life, because it's all those things, those human things that the false self, the shadow person, the things that are not putting out the light in the world. It literally is internal. You're kind of staining your soul, I guess, a little bit with it.
And what Jesus is teaching, what he's going to demonstrate, is the difference between that false notion of death and true death.
Right.
True death being separation from God. And his...
Like not loss of life, but separation from God.
Right, and his death will destroy that.
Right.
That there is no separation from God. But our choosing, as you say, that false self, and to distance ourselves and to put ourselves on the outside, that is death. Physical death is not. That's part of, to go back to the language of the wisdom of Solomon, that is the generative goodness of the world, of God's creation.
God did not create death.
Right.
God created permanent death. He created everlasting life. And when it's not everlasting life, that's not what he created. That's what the wicked summon. Okay. Because that's what it gets again confusing with, well, I thought God created everything.
So who are the wicked after all of that? Well, the teaching shows us that they are the ones who choose ignorance, who stubbornly maintain a sense of self and its will to power. The ways of the wicked are trusting in our own ability, believing in the power of access and wealth, and living in the illusion of our false selves. So in other words, the wicked are really not our enemies. The wicked are not those who differ from us politically or culturally or morally. The wicked are, in fact, any and all of us at any given time. The alternative that Jesus offers is true discipleship, which requires change, which requires or leads to transformation. It doesn't have much to do with intelligence or with willpower or with perfection, but it has everything to do with honesty and humility and a willingness to surrender, and with true courage, which all of those things take. God loves us and wants to draw near us, but first we have to want to draw near to God. Coming to church today was a good first step, but what will be really important is what we all do tomorrow morning on Monday. So begin by taking some time tomorrow morning to draw close to God, and He will help you live your faith, to avoid the ways of the wicked, to live the full life that He has dreamed for you. And He will help you to proclaim that faith in your life on Monday and throughout the week. Amen.
So I'm going to ask one question, though. This lesson talks about if you draw closer to God, you will push away the wicked.
Right.
I got that wrong, but the idea is drawing closer to God is a good thing. And and God will come to you. What are some specific things that it's us drawing closer to God?
Well, the one thing I think that I mentioned at the end of the sermon was to give some time, because that's the most valuable thing you have. Give some time in the morning and in the evening to just being present to God. But it's not about reading scripture. It's not about reading a devotional. It's about simply making yourself available and being present to God, and to invite. We talk about that openness and inviting in. Open yourself and invite God in. And you can do that with breathing. You can do it with techniques for clearing your mind, but being intentional in doing that, about being prayerful and opening yourself to God. Of course, as I said in the sermon, going to church is a start. It's a good
That's the bare
first
minimum.
step.
But that's the minimum, right?
That's a good step, and
But
it's a big
good.
one.
It's
a good one. And as the late, great Verna Dozier, who was a wonderful lay teacher in the Episcopal Church, said, the most important thing that happens is what happens on Monday morning.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that in your sermon too. It's like, look, Sunday is all great, but it's what you do on Monday we really start seeing into the world stuff. Not, you're getting out into your life, and that's when are these messages creeping into your life, not just on your Sunday self.
And that's in those moments of reflection and opening. If you acquire that as a habit, you can carry that with you out into your day. You really can. So that when you're in that difficult moment, and I mentioned to you before we started recording, some of the hardest moments of my ministry have been not with the ill, not with the dying, not with people in distress, because there's a closeness and a tenderness in that. But it's when people come to me in an oppositional frame of mind, and they want to be oppositional, and they want to draw me into that too. And we all have that at some point in our lives or in our days. The tendency is always to be drawn into it because we want to win, we want to defend ourselves, we don't want to be vulnerable. But I do think that we can cultivate some ways of being that can allow us to step back from that, and to be and to speak out of the heart rather than out of all of our false stuff. And I think that is when we say draw closer to God. I think that's what that is about.
Well, I will say one thing. I saw a great documentary about Colin Hay, lead singer of Men at Work.
Okay.
Remember that?
I do.
Come from the Land Down Under.
Wow, that's a flashback, Johnny.
He has one of my favorite songs, actually. It's called Overkill. It's on their second record. It's a beautiful song. It is so beautiful. Great songwriter, but the documentary is about how he rose to the top of the world, like literally the biggest band in the world. And then he was playing for like 8 people in like a dive bar in the 90s. And he's starting over again. But now he's come back. The show Scrubs played his music, and boy, he had a resurgence and all this stuff.
Okay.
But the whole thing follows his career. But his best friend tells the story of he is so great as a comedian, too. So he goes out and plays acoustic show, and he talks about his vulnerability. And you'll hear, of course, in a songwriter, they tell their story, and they show their flaws and their vulnerability in their music all the time. But he tells stories with the music. And his friend said, it's so amazing to watch a guy who should be so bitter, and he's learned not to be, because he loves this climb back up. And he's actually happier now than he was on top of the world. And he goes out there, and he's so invulnerable to his critics because of his vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because he lays it all out and is open with himself, and had to go through that journey, I think. You had to have something we can all never imagine what it's like to be at the top of that world like that, and to be crawling way back up the ladder. But just I love that saying, being totally vulnerable leaves you invulnerable to anybody else. And I think that's humility. That's a massive humility.
It's the tremendous power of humility.
Yeah.
And we don't want to acknowledge that. Probably because it's so difficult.
Hard to do.
Well, and you have to empty out your ego. You really do. And we're so attached to ego. And the danger in trying to empty that out is that you fall into a kind of self-loathing, and you don't want to do that.
It's not funny. It's self-deprecating, but not funny.
Right.
Yeah.
But to genuinely do it and then be able to live out of that place, and I'll go back to one of your favorite places to be, and that is in the Star Wars story. And that is, in the final moments of Luke Skywalker, if you kill me now, I'll be more powerful than I ever was. And that total vulnerability, that he has nothing. He has no way of defending himself. And that is, once again, in that story, is turning on its head the notion of death. And also life and death and power.
And he was an impetulant youngster who didn't have wisdom, and learned with the wisdom came with him, oh my gosh, my power is in my letting go.
Right.
Not the power in holding on. It's actually saying, do what you will.
Right.
Wow, that's interesting. Wow. And I always like ending on a Star Wars reference. But it goes back to Jesus let go of this earthly world because he said, this is out of my control. But again, part of the prophecy. It had to be, the righteous man had to be struck down this way.
That is the story.
That makes it inconvenient for every one of our actions.
Life is just inconvenient.
And you said it's suffering. Life is suffering and incredibly inconvenient.
It is. And most of our action is directed at ameliorating the suffering and getting around the inconvenience. What a waste.
But you have to hit it head on. You can't ignore the inconvenience. You have to hit it head on against the Mobius strip of life.
Right.
I want to run away from it, but I have to run to it to be able to get better. But if I don't, I'm going to get worse.
You have to run right at it. And that's stoic, right? The obstacle is the way.
Yes.
You have to go right at the obstacle, and it will be the way through.
Let's ignore the wolf long enough, and you will be dinner.
Well, that's ominous.
It was true.
It was true.
The wolf's sitting there. You got to deal with him at some point. You can't just act like he's not sitting there. You either have to act like you're big and get your coat open and yell at him or something, or I don't know, start walking the other way and hope for the best. But you can't just ignore the wolf.
Do something. Do something. Well, wherever this fits in, as we were talking about Luke Skywalker, I went back to that Yoda moment, right, with the young Luke and his impetuosity. And when Yoda looks at him and he says, always in the future, never right here, where you are. And we've talked about that before, about that landscape and that map of reality. Mm-hmm. Where am I really right now? And what do I really have to confront right now? And what do I bring right now? Not some image of myself as I want to be, but as I really am right now.
Well, that's good. Right now, we're at the end of the show.
We are.
We're a little long on this one. This was good. There's, again, great readings today. I enjoyed the sermon. I really liked the Ray Bradbury book. Because like I said, I do remember the movie being quite crappy. So the Wikipedia that I did go and read about, it was quite marred in multiple problems with directors, and they reshot it. Mm-hmm. And it was a carnival of errors through the whole thing, and I think that's why it's in the vault these days, and it's not easily found.
Probably so.
But the book is well loved, and I will say there's a large group of people who love the Bradbury book. Again, a kid-like story, but incredible adult themes in it. So
a really rich story.
Yeah, cool.
I think as many works of truly great writers, and I think Bradbury was one.
Yeah.
We tend to dismiss him because he wrote popular things. He wrote some pulp fiction. Yeah. He was in that genre of fantasy and horror, and we tend to kind of push that off to the side. Same way we sort of poo-poo on Stephen King, and that's not fair. It's not fair.
That's ignorance.
It is. It is. Yeah.
So, this has been great. Thank you so much, Beverly, for your time.
Thank you, Johnny, for your interest.
Thanks for listening. And as usual, please, subscribe to the show. We would love some reviews and ratings on iTunes. You can email us at pulpit2pew.com. I am also at johnnygwin.com. And then it'd be great if you shared the show with a friend that might like it as well. And thanks for listening. And I am Johnny Gwin.
And I'm Beverly Gibson.
And Beverly, end on your final word.
Amen.
If you'd like to know more about Beverly Gibson and Christ Church Cathedral, please visit christchurchcathedralmobile.org. There you'll find information on the church, Reverend Beverly Gibson's recorded sermons, and sermon notes. If you want to know more about Johnny and his Sabbadoodles, visit pulpit2pew.com. I would also like to thank Deep Fried Studios and producer Stacey Wellborn. Without her, this show would not get made. If you have any comments, likes, dislikes, please send information to Stacey at deepfriedstudios.com. Everyone have a great day, and thanks for listening.